I returned early to my mansion. HOA Karen called cops, but she'd lived there 3 weeks. How could someone returning to their own mansion end up facing the police? Why would a person who had only lived there for 3 weeks believe calling the cops was the right move? If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if someone questioned your right to enter your own home? What happened next unfolded so naturally that, at first, it almost seemed like an ordinary afternoon until one unexpected encounter changed everything. "You don't belong here," the woman said before I had even turned off my engine. The flashing blue lights bouncing across the black iron gate of my own mansion looked surreal, reflecting off the hood of my dark gray SUV as if I had accidentally driven into someone else's life. A police cruiser idled behind me while another blocked part of the street, neighbors quietly gathering on their driveways, pretending not to watch while watching every second. Standing confidently in the middle of my circular driveway entrance was a woman I had never seen before, wearing an HOA badge clipped proudly to her polo shirt, her arms crossed like she believed the entire neighborhood answered to her. "That's him, officers," she announced with complete certainty. "He's been trying to get inside this house." I looked from her to the officers, then slowly back at the familiar stone columns framing the entrance, the same columns my parents had commissioned 12 years earlier when they purchased the property. I had memorized every inch of that estate long before she ever learned its address. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the neighborhood, while the fountain behind the locked gate continued its steady rhythm, completely unaware that a stranger was explaining to police why I supposedly didn't belong there. One officer stepped forward with calm professionalism and asked if I could identify myself before attempting to enter the residence. I handed him my driver's license without argument, keeping my voice steady because experience had taught me something important. Facts never become stronger when they're shouted. The woman, however, seemed energized by my silence. She insisted she knew every homeowner on the street, claimed she had been helping protect the community ever since moving in, and repeated that she had never once seen me near this property. There was confidence in every word she spoke, the kind that only comes from believing your assumptions are the same thing as evidence. I glanced toward the security cameras mounted discreetly beneath the roofline, then toward the keypad beside the gate that had recognized my access code thousands of times before. My phone rested quietly in the center console, containing every remote control feature for the house, every security notification, every maintenance record accumulated over years of ownership. None of that mattered yet. Not because the truth was missing, but because the truth didn't need to rush. The officers remained respectful, asking measured questions while the woman continued filling every silence with certainty. Then she proudly mentioned that she had lived in the neighborhood for 3 weeks and already knew exactly who belonged there. 3 weeks. I almost smiled. I had spent 12 years paying property taxes on the mansion behind that gate, and somehow the newest resident on the block had decided I was the stranger. At that moment, standing outside my own front entrance while someone else claimed authority over my home, I realized this ordinary return from a shortened business trip was about to become something none of us would forget. The officer studied my driver's license for a moment before looking back at me with the same neutral expression he had worn since arriving, and I appreciated that. He had not taken anyone's side. He was simply doing his job. That was more than enough for me because I had learned years ago that patience usually reaches the truth faster than pride ever will. My name is Ethan Carter, and that mansion behind the gate was not some recent purchase or flashy investment. It had been my home for 12 years. My parents bought the property when the neighborhood was still being developed, long before the Homeowners Association became obsessed with appearances and committee meetings. After they retired to North Carolina, they transferred ownership to me, and I promised I would preserve everything they had worked so hard to build. I kept that promise even though my career often pulled me away from home for weeks at a time. As a senior engineering consultant, I traveled across the country inspecting large infrastructure projects, reviewing construction plans, and helping cities solve complicated engineering problems. Airports, rental cars, hotels, and conference rooms had become as familiar to me as my own living room. Fortunately, modern technology made distance almost irrelevant. Every security camera on the estate streamed directly to my phone. Every maintenance schedule was automated. The landscaping company checked in every Tuesday morning. The pool service arrived on Fridays. The cleaning crew visited twice each month whenever I was traveling. Even when I was hundreds of miles away, I always knew exactly what was happening at home. I had actually returned 3 days earlier than planned because a bridge inspection project in Colorado finished ahead of schedule. I thought surprising myself with a quiet evening at home sounded better than spending another night in a hotel. During the drive from the airport, I imagined simple things that suddenly felt luxurious after weeks away. Sitting on my back patio with a cup of coffee before sunrise, hearing the fountain outside my office window, walking through rooms filled with familiar memories instead of anonymous hotel furniture. It never crossed my mind that someone would question whether I belonged there. My neighbors had always been friendly, although many of the original families had gradually moved away over the years. New owners arrived, houses changed hands, and faces became less familiar every season. I rarely paid much attention to neighborhood gossip because I was usually traveling, and when I was home, I preferred quiet evenings over community meetings. Apparently, that had created an unusual situation. Someone could move into the neighborhood, confidently assume they knew every resident, and never realize. The owner of the largest property on the street simply happened to be away more often than he was home. As I stood outside the closed gate watching the officers quietly compare my identification with the address displayed on their computer, I realized that my years of coming and going without fanfare had unintentionally set the stage for the misunderstanding unfolding in front of me. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. I spent my professional life verifying facts before making decisions, yet the person accusing me had reached her conclusion after nothing more than 3 weeks of observation and complete confidence in her own assumptions. The woman finally introduced herself without anyone asking. "My name is Linda Brooks, and I am on the HOA Welcome Committee," she said with a tone that suggested the title carried far more authority than it actually did. She stood a few feet away from the officers, shoulders squared, holding a neatly organized folder decorated with the Homeowners Association logo. Everything about her appearance communicated preparation. Her clothes were immaculate, her posture was confident, and every sentence sounded rehearsed, as though she had been waiting for an opportunity to demonstrate how seriously she took her new role. Listening quietly, I began to understand how this strange situation had developed. Linda had only moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks earlier after purchasing a house at the opposite end of the community. According to what she eagerly explained to the officers, she immediately volunteered for every committee she could join, attended every association meeting, introduced herself to nearly every family on the street, and spent hours learning the neighborhood rules. She proudly described herself as someone who believed communities stayed safe only when residents paid close attention to unfamiliar faces. In her mind, she was not creating problems. She honestly believed she was preventing them. Unfortunately, confidence built on incomplete information can be surprisingly convincing. She pointed toward my mansion several times while explaining that she walked past the property almost every evening and had never once seen me enter or leave. She mentioned that the landscaping crew always arrived on schedule, that delivery vehicles occasionally stopped at the gate, and that maintenance workers came and went throughout the month. To her, those observations formed a complete picture. The owner, she assumed, must have lived somewhere else or perhaps rented the property seasonally. Since she had never personally met the homeowner, she quietly filled the gaps in her knowledge with assumptions that slowly became facts in her own mind. As she continued speaking, I realized she had built an entire narrative based entirely on routine appearances. She did not know about my travel schedule. She did not know the estate was managed remotely whenever I worked out of state. She did not know the security system automatically coordinated deliveries and maintenance appointments while I was away. She certainly did not know that I had approved every service she mentioned through my phone from hundreds of miles away. Yet every detail she described was technically true. The problem was not the facts she observed. The problem was the conclusion she attached to them. One of the officers politely asked her how long she had actually lived in the community. "Just over 3 weeks," she answered proudly, almost as though the short amount of time proved how quickly she had become involved. I noticed the officer write something in his notebook before glancing toward the stone entrance where my family name remained discreetly engraved on a bronze plaque beside the gate. Linda had walked past that plaque countless times, but she had apparently never connected the name with the man now standing a few yards away. Watching her confidently explain my own property to me was almost fascinating because every new sentence revealed just how easily certainty can grow when curiosity disappears. I remained silent, knowing that the truth was already waiting patiently behind the gate, requiring nothing more than the opportunity to introduce itself. The afternoon air remained unusually still as the officers continued verifying the information on their computers, and nobody seemed eager to break the silence except Linda. She stepped closer to the entrance, gesturing toward the mansion with absolute confidence, as though she had personally supervised everything that happened behind those gates. "If he really owns this place," she said, "then why has nobody seen him?" It was an honest question, but it came from the wrong assumption. I had spent years building a life that often required me to be away from home, and the neighborhood had quietly adapted to that routine long before Linda ever arrived. The mail was collected by a trusted service whenever I traveled. Deliveries were scheduled through my property management application. Every contractor, landscaper, and maintenance technician entered only after receiving temporary digital access that I personally approved. From the street, the mansion always appeared occupied and carefully maintained, yet very few people ever saw me because my schedule rarely matched everyone else's. I usually left before sunrise for flights or returned late in the evening after long projects. Even when I was home, I preferred the privacy the estate had always offered. That was one of the reasons my parents had fallen in love with the property years earlier. The officer handed me back my driver's license and politely asked whether I had any additional identification connecting me to the residence. "Of course," I replied calmly. "Most of it is inside the house, but some of it is already with me." I reached into the center console and removed a slim leather portfolio that always traveled with me. Inside were copies of insurance documents, vehicle registration paperwork listing the property address, utility statements, and several other routine records I carried during business travel. The officer accepted them with a professional nod while Linda folded her arms again, clearly expecting that none of it would matter. "Anyone can print paperwork," she commented confidently. I did not respond. There was no reason to argue over documents that could easily be verified. Instead, I looked toward the keypad mounted beside the wrought iron gate, the same keypad I had used thousands of times over the past 12 years. Beyond it, the long stone driveway curved through rows of maple trees before disappearing toward the mansion. The fountain continued flowing peacefully in the distance, and I noticed one of the security cameras slowly rotating as it completed its programmed patrol. Everything behind that gate continued operating exactly as it always had, quietly waiting for the rightful owner to come home. One officer followed my gaze and asked a simple question. "Do you have access to the security system from your phone?" I smiled for the first time that afternoon. Every camera, every lock, every light, every gate, every alarm, and every maintenance log, I answered. Linda immediately interrupted, insisting that applications could be shared or borrowed, but her voice sounded slightly less certain than before. The officers exchanged a brief glance without saying anything. They were no longer listening to opinions. They were beginning to look for evidence. I unlocked my phone, opened a familiar application that I had used almost daily for years, and waited as the home screen loaded, knowing the next few moments would allow the house itself to speak far more clearly than I ever could. The familiar interface appeared on my screen within seconds, displaying the live status of every system connected to the property. The officers stepped closer, careful not to invade my personal space, while Linda remained several feet away with an expression that suggested she still expected the technology to prove nothing. The home dashboard immediately showed the address of the estate, my registered account name, and a timeline of recent activity stretching back months. Every maintenance visit, every package delivery, every gate access request, and every security notification had been automatically recorded. I calmly selected the live camera feed overlooking the front entrance. The image appeared instantly, showing all of us standing outside the gate in real time. One officer looked from the phone screen to the gate and quietly nodded after confirming the matching view. Then I opened the property management history. The landscaping crew that Linda had mentioned earlier had checked in every Tuesday using temporary digital credentials that I personally approved. The pool maintenance company had entered every Friday morning under the same system. The house cleaning service, window specialists, irrigation technicians, and pest control contractors all appeared in chronological order with precise dates, arrival times, and departure times. Every visit had been authorized through my account. Linda watched silently as the officer scrolled through the records without interruption. I could almost see her carefully constructed assumptions beginning to lose their foundation. The officer then asked whether the gate itself could be controlled remotely. I answered by turning the phone toward him and showing the control panel. There were options for lighting, cameras, alarms, garage doors, climate systems, and the front entrance. Without touching anything yet, I explained that every command required biometric authentication linked to my account. The officer asked whether I would be willing to demonstrate. I placed my thumb on the sensor, waited for the confirmation message, and selected the option to unlock the pedestrian entrance rather than opening the entire gate. A soft electronic tone echoed across the driveway, followed by the quiet click of the magnetic lock releasing. Nobody had touched the keypad. Nobody had entered a code. The command came directly from the secure account registered to the property owner. One officer walked to the entrance, gently pulled the gate open several inches, then allowed it to close again before the lock automatically re-engaged. He looked back at me with a noticeably different expression, not because the situation had been resolved, but because another piece of independently verifiable evidence had just confirmed what I had calmly stated from the beginning. Linda immediately suggested that perhaps I had been given temporary access by the real owner while managing the property. It was the first time she sounded less certain than convinced. Her explanation required adding another assumption instead of answering the facts already in front of her. The senior officer thanked both of us for remaining cooperative before speaking into his radio and requesting verification directly through the county property database. I recognized that step immediately. Unlike opinions, neighborhood rumors, or personal observations, county ownership records did not speculate. They simply documented legal reality. I slipped my phone back into my hand and looked once more toward the mansion beyond the trees, knowing that every question asked so far had been answered with evidence, and the final answer was now only one official record away. The wait lasted only a few minutes, but it felt much longer because nobody seemed interested in filling the silence anymore. The conversation had shifted away from opinions and toward verification, and that changed the atmosphere completely. The senior officer listened carefully to the dispatcher through his radio, while occasionally glancing between me, the property, and the information displayed on the computer inside his patrol vehicle. Linda remained standing near the entrance with her folder held tightly against her side. She no longer spoke with the effortless certainty that had defined the beginning of the encounter. Instead, she watched every expression on the officers' faces as though trying to predict the answer before it arrived. I stood quietly beside my vehicle, noticing familiar details that had always made this place feel like home. The stone walkway leading from the gate toward the front porch curved around flower beds my mother had designed years earlier. The mature maple trees lining the driveway had grown several feet taller since I inherited the property, and the bronze family plaque beside the entrance had weathered gracefully without losing its polished finish. Every corner of the estate carried memories that no official record could ever capture, yet I understood that legal ownership would still need to be established through documents rather than sentiment. The radio finally came alive again. The dispatcher calmly read the ownership information exactly as it appeared in the county database. The property address matched my driver's license. The legal owner listed in the county records was Ethan Carter. The ownership history confirmed the transfer from my parents more than a decade earlier. Property tax records were current. There were no disputes, no outstanding questions, and no indication that anyone else possessed ownership rights. The senior officer thanked the dispatcher, wrote several notes in his report, and then looked directly at me before extending my identification back into my hand. "Mr. Carter," he said respectfully, "the county records confirm that you are the legal owner of this residence." His voice remained professional, but the situation had unmistakably changed. He then turned toward Linda with the same calm tone he had maintained throughout the afternoon. He explained that her decision to report suspicious activity had been made in good faith based on what she believed she observed, but the official records established that I was the homeowner and had every legal right to access my property. Linda blinked several times as though trying to fit that information into the version of reality she had already accepted. She quietly mentioned that she had never seen me before. The officer nodded politely and replied that unfamiliarity was not evidence of unauthorized access. That single sentence seemed to settle the entire misunderstanding more effectively than anything else said that day. I appreciated the fairness in his words because they acknowledged both the importance of community awareness and the greater importance of verified facts. As the tension continued to dissolve, I unlocked my phone once more, authenticated my account, and selected the option to open the main entrance. The heavy wrought iron gate began moving smoothly along its track with the same soft mechanical sound I had heard thousands of times before. Beyond it, the driveway stretched toward the mansion exactly as it always had, patiently waiting for its owner to come home after an unexpectedly unforgettable return. As the gate completed its slow, familiar movement, the atmosphere on the street changed in a way that could not be measured by words alone. A few neighbors who had quietly watched from their driveways began returning to their afternoon routines, satisfied that the mystery had finally been resolved. The officers remained for a few more minutes to finish their report, and their professionalism never wavered from beginning to end. Before leaving, the senior officer thanked both of us for cooperating and reminded Linda that reporting suspicious activity was appropriate when supported by reasonable observations, but assumptions should never replace verification. She nodded quietly, no longer trying to defend the story she had built over the past 3 weeks. I could see the realization settling in that knowing a neighborhood and actually knowing its history were two very different things. I walked through the open gate and paused for a moment near the bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance. The Carter family name reflected softly in the afternoon sunlight, exactly where it had been since my parents first installed it years ago. Linda followed my glance and stared at the plaque herself. "I never noticed that before," she admitted almost under her breath. I smiled politely because I believed her. Sometimes people only see what they expect to see. Everything else simply blends into the background. The officers wished me a pleasant evening before returning to their patrol vehicles. As the engines started and the flashing lights disappeared down the street, the neighborhood slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The fountain continued flowing. Birds settled back into the maple trees, and the peaceful silence that had always defined the property gradually returned. Linda remained standing near the sidewalk for another moment before taking a few hesitant steps toward me. Her confident posture from earlier had softened considerably. She apologized for the misunderstanding and explained that after moving into the community, she genuinely believed she was helping keep the neighborhood safe. I appreciated that she chose honesty instead of excuses. I told her that looking out for neighbors was never the problem. The problem was deciding someone did not belong before asking a simple question. She listened carefully without interrupting. It was the first real conversation we had shared all afternoon. I also explained that my work required frequent travel and that many longtime residents already knew my schedule. Because so many original homeowners had moved away over the years, newer families naturally had little opportunity to meet me. That absence had unintentionally created the perfect conditions for mistaken assumptions. Linda nodded again and admitted that she had been eager to prove herself after joining the Homeowners Association almost immediately after moving in. She wanted to contribute, earn trust, and demonstrate responsibility, but somewhere along the way she had confused visibility with authority. As we finished talking, I realized neither of us had actually been arguing about a house. We had been confronting something much larger. It was the difference between believing you know the truth because you have observed part of a story and patiently waiting until all of the facts reveal themselves. Standing there in my own driveway, finally ready to walk inside after an unexpectedly long afternoon, I knew the conversation was ending, but the lesson behind it would stay with both of us far longer than anyone on that street could imagine. When I finally carried my suitcase through the front door, the familiar scent of cedar wood and polished hardwood floors immediately replaced the tension that had followed me since I arrived at the gate. The entry lights had already adjusted automatically to my preferred evening setting, casting a warm glow across the marble foyer exactly as they had done hundreds of times before. I placed my luggage beside the staircase and stood quietly for a moment, listening to the gentle sound of the fountain outside filtering through the open atrium windows. It was remarkable how quickly a home could restore a sense of calm once uncertainty had been left outside. After unpacking only the essentials, I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and walked into my home office overlooking the front driveway. From there, I could see nearly the entire entrance to the estate through the large windows. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, almost as though the afternoon had never happened. My phone chimed softly with a routine security notification confirming that the front gate had returned to its normal operating schedule after being opened manually. A second notification summarized every access event from the day, including the exact time I had remotely unlocked the pedestrian entrance and later opened the main gate. Looking through those logs reminded me how quietly technology had protected the truth long before anyone asked for proof. Every command, every camera recording, every authorized visitor had been documented without emotion or assumption. Later that evening, another notification appeared, this time from the Homeowners Association. The message informed residents that an upcoming community gathering would introduce new neighbors and encourage longtime homeowners to share information about the history of the neighborhood. I smiled as I read it because the timing felt almost symbolic. Communities become stronger when people know one another beyond quick observations from a sidewalk. The following Saturday, I decided to attend for the first time in years. The gathering took place in the clubhouse courtyard beneath large oak trees where families chatted over refreshments while children played nearby. Linda was there as well, but she looked noticeably different from the woman I had first met outside my gate. Instead of standing apart with complete certainty, she spent most of the afternoon introducing herself, asking questions, and listening carefully to stories from residents who had lived there for decades. When she saw me, she walked over with a genuine smile and introduced me to several newer homeowners who had never realized the estate at the end of the street belonged to someone who traveled so frequently for work. We spoke comfortably for several minutes about engineering projects, neighborhood history, and the changes that had taken place over the years. There was no awkwardness because the misunderstanding had already been replaced by understanding. As the evening came to an end, I looked around the community and noticed conversations happening between people who probably would never have met otherwise. It occurred to me that trust is not built by deciding who belongs. It grows by taking the time to learn who people really are before reaching conclusions. That afternoon outside my gate had started with assumptions and flashing patrol lights, but it quietly ended by opening something far more valuable than an iron entrance. It opened the possibility for neighbors to become an actual community instead of simply sharing the same street. Several months have passed since that afternoon, yet every time I drive through the front gate, I still remember how easily appearances can mislead people when they replace questions with assumptions. The mansion itself has not changed. The fountain still greets every visitor with the same gentle rhythm. The maple trees continue growing a little taller each season. The security cameras quietly perform their work without drawing attention, recording facts instead of opinions. My travel schedule remains just as demanding as ever, taking me across the country to engineering projects that often keep me away for weeks at a time. But returning home feels different now because the neighborhood feels different too. At the next annual Homeowners Association meeting, I accepted an invitation to briefly introduce myself to many of the newer residents. Instead of talking about the misunderstanding, I shared the history of the property, how my parents had built their life there, and why my profession required frequent travel. Several longtime neighbors smiled as they remembered stories about my family, while newer homeowners finally connected the familiar estate with the person who actually lived there. Linda attended that meeting as well. She surprised everyone by proposing a simple change to the neighborhood welcome process. Rather than relying on assumptions or informal observations, every new resident would receive a directory introducing homeowners who wished to participate, along with a brief history of the community and contact information for the property management office whenever questions arose. The proposal received overwhelming support because it focused on communication instead of suspicion. Later, Linda thanked me privately for remaining patient throughout everything that had happened. She admitted that moving into an unfamiliar community had made her eager to prove she belonged, and somewhere along the way she had mistaken confidence for certainty. I told her something I genuinely believed. Every person makes mistakes. What defines character is not whether mistakes happen, but whether someone is willing to learn from them after the truth becomes clear. She smiled, and for the first time since we met, there was no tension between us, only mutual respect. Looking back, I realized the most important evidence that day was never the county records, the security system, the digital access logs, or even the deed itself. Those documents confirmed legal ownership, but something far more valuable emerged afterward. An entire neighborhood learned that real trust cannot be built on assumptions, and real authority never comes from speaking the loudest or wearing an official badge. It comes from respecting facts, remaining patient, and allowing the truth enough time to reveal itself. Every detail that seemed ordinary at the beginning of that afternoon eventually found its place. The cameras quietly documented reality. The gate recognized its rightful owner without hesitation. The records never changed because opinions changed. They simply reflected what had always been true. Whenever I hear someone say they know everything about a person after only a brief impression, I think back to the woman who had lived on my street for 3 weeks and believed she understood exactly who belonged there. That experience reminded me of something I will carry for the rest of my life. Justice does not need to arrive with raised voices or dramatic speeches. It often arrives quietly, supported by patience, evidence, and truth. And in the end, truth always knows its way home.